The millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking about a lot of different topics, so this is one of those ones where I encourage you to stay tuned, even if the topic isn't terribly interesting to you at that moment, and I'm certainly going to work to make sure that all of them are, but even if it isn't, we'll be moving around all over the map today. We're going to be looking at what is happening in the Elizabeth Warren campaign. Number of individuals that are starting to have serious questions about some of the polls. You cannot go to probably any internet website without seeing some polls about the fact that a majority or a near majority of Americans in this country are convinced that Donald Trump should be removed from office. But I'm going to let you dig into those polls and find out a little bit more of what is honestly in the polls if you read them. But most people just see the headline and go, whoa, that doesn't look good for the president. And, of course, even a most recent poll saying that if Hillary Clinton did jump into the race, she would beat him next November. Don't believe that one either, but we'll get into some of those polls a little bit later and talk about some of that. I might just mention as a program note that we're also going to go back to this issue of impeachments that's in the news. And then in the next hour, we got Robert Wolgemuth and Nancy Lee DeMoss, now Wolgemuth, since they are married, talking about the book, You Can Trust God to Write Your Story. So that'll be kind of an interruption in some of the news cycle, which I think all of us need. I think you'll really enjoy their conversation. And then we'll get back into the news cycle because in the third hour, David Limbaugh will be with us. Guilty by Reason of Insanity, just an outstanding book that pulls together all the insanity that has been said. Many of those appeared in his columns, many of them in my commentaries, many of our conversations we've had around the round table, but also gets into some other issues like critical race theory and a variety of others, and two whole chapters just on the issue of socialism. And I might just mention we've already posted his commentary exposing the fraud of socialism, which is kind of a summary of some of that on the website, so it would give you a chance to have an opportunity to learn a little bit more. I'm going to get into this whole idea of polling and impeachment in just a minute, and that is our first article on the website. But before we do so, I thought for a minute I would talk about Elizabeth Warren. This will probably be the only comments we'll have today about the political campaign, but it was something we were going to cover on Friday, and sometimes I look around and Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford have a lot to say, and I say, well, we'll postpone it till Monday, which is what we did. And I'm glad we did because there's a new article that came out in Red State by this author. It says Bonchi. I don't really know much more about the name there. Most of these have good bylines. This one does not. But saying that Elizabeth Warren is a paper tiger, saying I'm not saying that she can't win, but I am saying that she's incredibly overrated. This is a woman who's been left mostly unscathed so far in the current election cycle. The media fawn over her constantly. Most of her opponents are scared to take shots at her. And even Donald Trump has largely laid off since the Pocahontas ordeal, no doubt holding his fire for the general election. And there's sometimes people refer to a presidential election like a marathon. That's a good metaphor, but I think a better one is it's like baseball. You know, have to come back to baseball since I love baseball, but just think about this for just a minute because a marathon, you just run it and it's over with. A baseball game, you play game after game after game after game, and over time, it's a meritocracy. 162 games in the regular season, and of course the postseason, which we've just finished. And in some respects, it really does help you understand who has the ability to really be an outstanding player, because you can have a streak of a couple of games and look really good, but then, over 162 games, that's real different. Imagine, for example, if you played in the NFL versus Major League Baseball. If you have 10 good games, Let's say you're a running back and you run for 100 yards in 10 of those games, or you're a receiver and catch for more than 100 yards, or you're a tackler and you tackle, maybe get a dozen tackles in some of those games. That'd look real good because 10 games out of 16, you look real good. 10 games out of 162 doesn't look so good after all. And that's exactly what's going on right now, and that is that as much as many of us don't like the primary season, you have to begin to show up every single day. It's like a baseball player showing up at not only your home stadium or ball field, but your other visiting ball fields. You've got to hit every day. You've got to pitch every day. You've got to throw every day. And there's the same thing. Elizabeth Warren right now is looking good, but that's partially because she hasn't really hit any serious evaluation. But as our friends at the Wall Street Journal pointed out today, now we know why Elizabeth Warren took so long to release the financial details of her Medicare for All plan. The 20 pages of explanation she released Friday reveal that she is counting on the ideas for cost saving and new revenue that are a fiscal and health care fantasy. He says, you certainly can't criticize the new Iowa Democratic Caucus front-runner for lack of ambition. Despite criticism from fellow Democrats, she's sticking to her plan for a government takeover of American health care, including the elimination of private insurance that 170 million or so Americans now have. She continues to claim that this will cost not one penny on middle-class tax increases. Then they jokingly say she walks on water as well. And if you don't take that viewpoint, how about Jim Garrity writing in the National Review? Elizabeth Warren has a plan for that, and her plan runs on rainbows and unicorns. Warren unveiled how she would pay for Medicare for All without raising middle-class taxes this morning, and is basically relying on everyone involved in health care and medicine agreeing to do the same or more work for less money than they do so right now. Because, of course, what she wants to do is reduce the cost of medicine, where we'd only for various medical treatments and for various prescription drugs only pay 30% of what we do right now. You think that's going to happen? And that we would also reduce payments to physicians to Medicare rates. A lot of physicians don't even want to take Medicare because of this. So this is how she's figured out, according to her plan, that we can spend $52 trillion, that's with a T, $52 trillion for Medicare for All, and still, with a straight face, claim that there would be no middle-class tax increase at all. It would be funded somehow with approximately $20 trillion on taxes on employers, financial transactions, and various corporations over the next decade. And existing federal and state spending would account for the remaining $30 trillion in cost. And, of course, this would also, even if it was implemented, and it won't be, would also eliminate about 2 million jobs, because those would be the jobs of people in the healthcare industry right now. And so there would be the additional expense of trying to find homes and jobs and everything for those people as well. So it is just an illustration, again, that maybe right now we're in the preseason of Major League Baseball, as it goes, if I want to use the metaphor a little bit longer. And already there have been a number of games played, but, you got 162 games in the regular season for baseball. You've got a year and a half almost still, a year at least another month. And sooner or later, probably now sooner as we get close to the Iowa caucus, there are going to be some Democrats that are going to raise these questions. Certainly some people in the media are going to, and I've already mentioned a few in, of course, the Wall Street Journal and National Review. But pretty soon you can't keep this going for much longer before even people at ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, CNN, and the rest start saying these numbers simply do not add up. We come back, though. A lot of people say it's time to impeach and remove the president. What about those polls? We'll come back and talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We often talk about worldviews, but do we know how they were formed through history? Professor Glenn Sunshine wrote a great book entitled Why You Think the Way You Do, The Story of Western Worldviews from Rome to Home. It helps us see the influence of worldviews through history. and he defines a worldview as the framework you use to interpret the world and your place in it. He begins by discussing the worldview of Rome, and by the end of the book, we return to the same worldview. Western civilization is a product of ancient Roman civilization plus Christianity. Glenn Sunshine argues that once you remove Christianity, the modern world reverted back to Roman society and a recovery of the ancient pagan worldview. Like Rome, we value toleration as the supreme virtue. The Romans lived in an oversexed society. So is our society. Rome practiced abortion. So does our society. Rome was antinatal and made a deliberate attempt to prevent pregnancy. They focused on sexual enjoyment and did not want to bother with kids. In our modern world, birth rates in most of the Western democracies are plummeting. So how should Christians live in this world? Of course, we should live out a biblical worldview. Every generation is called to live faithfully to the gospel, and our generation is no exception. From history, we can see that the early church did live faithfully and transformed the Roman world. Christians produced a totally new civilization, Western culture. By living faithfully before the watching world, we will increase our credibility and earn the respect from those around us by living in accordance with biblical principles. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I want to talk about polls for just a few minutes, and don't have your eyes glaze over. I won't spend a lot of time on those. As a matter of fact, if you've heard me on this program at all, lots of times I say the only poll that really matters happens November. But the reality is that today, especially as I started looking at everything from Drudge Report to a variety of different websites, everybody's talking about the fact that the most recent polls, and these are from a variety of different sources, some that would be considered more liberal, progressive news outlets, all the way to some that would be more conservative news outlets, all say that their poll shows either a near majority or a majority of Americans actually say that they believe that President Donald Trump should be impeached and removed from office. Now, if you like Donald Trump, you just say, I'm not going to pay attention to any of those polls. And if you dislike Donald Trump, you say, see, that's why we need to get rid of this man. So I understand that a lot of people look at these polls almost like a political Rorschach test, an inkblot test. They see in it what they want to see. But for just a minute, I thought I would try to once again, as we have done so many times on this program, talk about the validity of polls and the vulnerability of polls. And if you find yourself saying, okay, I might even be willing to read a little bit more, I might do another commentary, but I just did a click real quickly on the number of commentaries I've written over the last, been about 11, 12 years now on polling. There are quite a few. And first of all, let me just go to the article we've posted, and I'm going to make some comments along the way. But Scott Moorfield does a good job. He says, as polling on impeachment again dominates the news cycle, it's worth revising and revisiting the issue from the perspective of those who support President Trump. He says, as I've noted here before, it's important not to get too wrapped up in these polls. However, it also would be unwise to take the position that there's no validity to any of them or the patterns they represent. And I appreciate the balance there. That's why I wanted to post this article, which appeared in Town Hall, and you might want to print it out. He points out that statistical sampling done properly is a thing, and political types should indeed take polling seriously. However, such polls merely represent public opinion during a very specific window. Right now, he says the complicit Trump-hating media is pushing impeachment like candy-flavored crack, purposely dumping many into falsely thinking that the president actually did something illegal and somehow deserves being removed from office. Now, let me, for just a minute, talk about polling generally before I get into some of the limitations that are in these polls that are getting front-page headlines. And the first is, you have some people that are always skeptical about polls because I always hear this, nobody's ever polled me. Well, I've had a couple of polls that have been asked, not by maybe Gallup or others, but I've had polls that where people have called up and asked me to survey something like this. But if you have taken any statistics, and I was forced to in undergraduate school, then revisit it in graduate school, you recognize that if you get a certain segment that is demographically accurate, you can, with 95% confidence, say that this is probably representative of the entire group within a couple of percentage points. And so if you get a very good, large sample, you can be very clearly arguing that this is an accurate look at our society or what people at that particular moment believe. Because I've used the same kind of statistical analysis in biology and other areas, sampling when you can't see all of the, for example, maybe the microtus in an area or meadow voles or deer or whatever, you sample a certain area and that sample gives you an idea of how many are there in the entire population. And so it works fairly well, but now we're back to the limitations because some of these individuals that have been doing these polls are oversampling one particular size. I'll jump down to the third paragraph that Scott Moorfield talks about. He says, according to Gallup, 31% of Americans identify as Democrats, 9% identify as Republicans, and almost 4 out of 10, or 38%, identify as independents. So it's almost one-third, not quite, but you get the idea. So if the polls are going to give you an honest assessment, they're going to do their best to try to get an accurate representation of those three political affiliations. Now, we get right into it. Let me just take the one from Fox News, the poll that was put out today on Drudge Report, and you can go to Fox News right now and read it. The Fox News poll methodology statement says it generally rates and weights only age, race, and education and area, but it doesn't look at party affiliation. Ding, 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 ding. That should right off the bat tell you, okay, and so there's a possibility that they have oversampled certain groups. Oh, yes, they have sampled rather dramatically Democrats. Are Democrats more likely to say that they would want to impeach the president? Probably, and they would want to remove him from office? Probably. And so right off the bat, you can see that even the Fox News poll, which many people might think would be a little more middle of the road, mainstream, maybe even a little bit conservative, even that poll samples Democrats rather significantly. And so it's a reason to not disagree with the poll because it was a very significant one. But when you have Democrats in those particular surveys continuously being oversampled, you then have to roll some of the numbers back. That's the first issue. That, of course, is a statistical number. Let's take another one. How's the question asked? It does seem to me that that is something that we see, and you can go now to the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, and it had, again, the same problem of, why is it they always seem to oversample Democrats? I don't know if they answer the phone more, there's more in the database. I don't know what it is. But again, they found the same kind of thing. But even there, then you have to ask what question was asked. And for many of them, the question was, should President Donald Trump be impeached and removed from office? And I appreciate Scott Moorfield pointing out that that is another issue, because when you ask that question, impeachment is one thing, and it's done in the House of Representatives, currently being done in a pretty partisan manner. I think most people would agree with that, by the Democrats in the House of Representatives, since you had all Democrats except for two voting for it, no Republicans voting for at least the process so far, which we'll get into in just a few minutes, which is certainly not due process, but I'll leave that for the next segment. But again, that is impeachment, which takes place in the House, which is different than then going to the Senate and removing an individual from office for high crimes and misdemeanors, which is a Senate function. So he said, might there be some who want to see him impeached as a sort of, if you will, punishment or check or something like that, but don't really want to remove him from office? And so that's another real question about how it is asked, especially in light of the fact that there has been this constant drumbeat day in and day out that this was quid pro quo. I think there is a need to educate individuals that, first of all, if you read the transcript, and a little bit later I'm going to talk about the fact that Donald Trump actually is talking about doing sort of an FDR fireside chat type of thing, where he would literally sit down and read the transcript from the call with the Ukrainian president. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it would be helpful, because how many people think that the president actually withheld military aid to Ukraine until they would, quote, investigate my political opponent, Joe Biden? Well, that's the narrative being put out by the press. If you've listened to this program any length of time at all, you know that's not accurate, number one. And number two, back to the key point, even if you were to concede the point, and I don't, but if you were just for a moment to say, even if that was done, has that ever been done before by other presidents? Yes, it has. And this is why the other day I reminded you that we were thinking that there might be a time where some of these presidential historians, the ones that show up on national public radio and on public broadcasting and sometimes on the mainstream media talking about past presidents, why we've been waiting for some of them to remind us that, the same kinds of quid pro quo really did take place in the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, certainly the Nixon administration, maybe even in the Carter administration. How did he get everybody to the peace table there? Probably under Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama. But, of course, we wouldn't, hear that now, because nobody wants to say, that is sort of business as usual in terms of foreign policy. So you have to take some of these polls at least with some level of discernment for a couple of reasons. They, at the moment, seem to be dramatically oversampling one particular political party over another. Number two, the way the questions are asked doesn't really give you maybe a little more of a nuanced answer. And then number three, of course, given the current drumbeat, how many people even, say, 6 months from now would answer the same way. So those are just a couple of things to think about. If you'd like to read the article by Scott Moorfield, it is the first article we have posted on the website. And I might just mention a little bit later, another article is one by David Limbaugh. We'll be talking about that with him in the third hour today. When we come back, let me talk a little bit about this issue of impeachment and some of the testimony that's been taking place, because as Gary Bauer said the other day, he was repeating Mark Meadows, who said after some of the testimony, a few of his Democratic colleagues looked like they were sucking lemons. So we'll talk about that right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention about a half an hour, we're going to have Robert Wolgemuth and Nancy Wolgemuth with us as we talk about their book, You Can Trust God to Write Your Story. And then later we'll have, in the next hour, David Limbaugh, Guilty by Reason of Insanity. But I thought for just a few minutes, give you a little bit of an update on the so-called impeachment inquiry. And yesterday you had House Minority Leader Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California. He was on some of the Sunday talk shows and on CBS Face the Nation. He was very critical of the process. He said the people deserve to know the facts, the truth, and the accountability. He then added, what we voted on Thursday is not due process. There's no transparency. He said 4 days later, the Dems, that is the Democrats, are right back at it. More depositions that people can't see. They made Adam Schiff the judge, the jury, and the prosecutor. So he's pretty upset about some of that as well. So he first of all talked about whether or not there is due process. And if you heard our conversation on Friday, I think Kelly Shackelford made a good point about the fact that there should be an opportunity for both sides to participate. And yet, interestingly enough, this vote actually simply pushed forward a resolution that allows two of these committees, both the Intelligence Committee and the Oversight Committee, to look at this, as well as a number of other committees to do that as well. But there isn't really any true existing impeachment inquiry because that's never really been voted on, number one. And number two, it's nothing like what existed in the past. If you go back and look at some of the rules there, if you look at the impeachment process both for Richard Nixon and for Bill Clinton, there were various rules, precedents, and procedures in the House that said that not only the chairman, in this case, these would be Democrats, but the minority leader, who would be the minority chairperson, would actually have to agree to various kinds of investigations. And that would be in an open, honest, and transparent way. And that is not happening. This is being pushed through, and it's no surprise that you couldn't find one Republican voting for that particular resolution that was put forth on Thursday. He does raise another question, and it's an important one. And that is, what about this so-called whistleblower? Because this is an individual who did not hear the phone call on July 25th, only heard about it in passing. There is really no reason for the whistleblower to even be significant since we now have the transcript, unless you accept, as some people have tried to make, that the transcript is incomplete and there was something else there. This is why, of course, the president has said maybe he will actually, in Franklin Delano Roosevelt style, have a, if you will, opportunity to have a fireside chat and read the transcript. But again, Kevin McCarthy put it this way, said that democracy is too precious to think that someone who's not on a phone call, that cannot stand before the American public and answer the question, that somehow we would change the course of that. I think the whistleblower should come forward in an open hearing. He can come even down to the basement, which is his way of saying go down there and protect him from the eyes of the media, but at least come forward and answer some of those questions. And we, again, recognize that if indeed you are going to be accused, then you have a right to cross-examine your accusers. Last night I was at an event which was Lifesavers and got a chance to sit next to Mark Davis, who was the MC of that event. And, of course, we got to hear Trey Gowdy. And he made a very good point that I'm probably going to use a few times. This is the first time I've used it on the air, but I'm sure I'll use it a number of other times. And as a prosecutor, he said, look, we've had to, in some cases, prepare even a 6-year-old child to go into a courtroom to answer questions and then be cross-examined about some of the horrific things that happened to that child. Since it's a family-oriented program, I'll just say that a lot of those have to do with what we would call sexual abuse, okay? But because we so value the opportunity for an individual who is being accused to be able to cross-examine their accuser, even if it's a 6-year-old child, can you not see how what is happening right now is unfair to not a 6-year-old child, but the President of the United States. And so the argument is, well, we'll just do this in secret and we'll just leak out some of the information that we want to be leaked to the press. But that brings me to another point I was going to make, and that is that the other day, when the information was leaked out, it was poorly handled, and I'm being generous. I think it was deliberately misused by the press. And the person we're talking about is a man by the name of Tim Morrison. He's the Senior Director of European and Russian Affairs at the National Security Council. And he testified in front of Representative Adam Schiff's, what some people call kangaroo court, on Thursday. First of all, it is very interesting that he was one of the officials who was authorized to listen in on President Trump's call with the Ukrainian president. So, first of all, he had firsthand knowledge of what was said. And so, if nothing else, makes him a much more credible witness, right, than a whistleblower who only heard things secondhand. But in order to be fair, Tim Morrison announced as he was giving his testimony that he was leaving the National Security Council, as individuals have been doing for some time. If you have somebody that actually endures even 4 years of the bureaucracy, they're certainly a masochist. And if they endure 8 years, there may be a screw loose. So, I mean, these are high pressure-packed kind of jobs, and oftentimes they have other opportunities to go. So here, before I even talk about what he said, you can now see the headlines that all came out saying top NSC Russian official to step down ahead of impeachment testimony. So it makes it sound like he was really concerned about what Donald Trump had done until you listen to what he actually said. In his testimony, Tim Morrison told the lawmakers, quote, "I want to be clear, I was not concerned that anything illegal was discussed. I want to be clear that anything illegal was discussed." So his argument was that there was no concern on his part as an individual with the National Security Council. He had a chance to hear it live, and that was his testimony. First of all, Gary Bauer mentions, did you hear that on the evening news? No, you didn't hear that either. What you may have heard, if you heard anything about Tim Morrison, was this, his concerns. Yes, he did, in his testimony, express his concern, but here's what the concern was. He was concerned that aspects of the call would leak out. Well, he was right about that, wasn't he? And he was concerned about, quote, how it would play out in Washington's polarized environment. Well, he was right about that as well, because he was concerned about how some of the deep state partisans would actually take his testimony and twist it and twist the words of Donald Trump. But again, guess what? When you actually go back and look at the various news articles, if they covered Tim Morrison at all, they simply said he was resigning, implying that he was disgusted with what was happening at the NSC, or that he was concerned. But his concern was the very valid concern that this would, in one way or another, be used and twisted to justify some kind of attack on the president. I don't think he anticipated that this would be used to justify an impeachment of the president, but nevertheless, that is the case. And of course, if you're going to go back to our whistleblower, the concern that some of these comments would be leaked and then be used by partisans was exactly, of course, what the whistleblower did. And, of course, this whistleblower, which we now know a little bit more about, who filed the initial Ukraine complaint, has worked for John Brennan, who's been a very vocal critic of Donald Trump. He worked for Susan Rice in the Obama's National Security Council, and as a variety of other things, certainly has been a questionable figure indeed as a, quote, whistleblower, because after all, he really wasn't a whistleblower in the company for what was happening in the company, the CIA, but a whistleblower for the President of the United States. Anyway, even though you might have seen Tim Morrison mentioned in the press about stepping down as an NSC advisor, or maybe heard something about his concerns, the people that actually heard the testimony, according to Representative Mark Meadows, He said, some of my Democratic colleagues look like they're sucking lemons this morning. And so even though maybe we didn't get an accurate rendition of what he actually said in that testimony, those that heard an individual who was the senior director of the European and Russian affairs at the National Security Council recognized that he didn't give them any real justification for impeachment. We come back, I want to just briefly talk about a prosecutor involved in another aspect of investigating what happened in 2016. A man that you probably never have heard about, and that's why I wanted to spend just a minute, because Jim Garrity said the last trusted prosecutor, somebody you probably don't know, but who is investigating some of the corruption surrounding 2016, which was, of course, the real context of the conversation with our president, with the president of Ukraine. So we'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention again that at the top of the hour, we're going to be talking with Robert Wolgemuth and Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth, and we'll be talking about their book, You Can Trust God to Write Your Story. And in the third hour, David Limbaugh will be with us as we talk about guilty by reason of insanity. And for just a minute, I want to mention an individual that you're going to hear more about. Matter of fact, his name was mentioned last night by Trey Gowdy, and my ears perked up because I said, I've never even heard of this individual, and there is a reason why, as you'll find out. His name is John Durham. He, as some people have said, I'm going to quote a lot from Jim Garrity here to make the point, is the most consequential and least known figure in Washington right now. In May, U.S. Attorney General William Barr selected him as the longtime prosecutor with a resume so sterling it nearly glows to investigate the origins of the special counsel's probe into Russian interference in the 2016 election and whether it was properly predicated. In other words, what started this investigation of Donald Trump? Well, I think it'd be the Steele dossier and a variety of others, allegations that there was some connection between the Trump campaign in Russia or the Trump campaign in Ukraine, when the reality is there was a very definite connection between the Hillary Clinton campaign in Ukraine, but we'll leave that for just a minute. And so some people are convinced, as indeed this is the case, that the deep state and various people in intelligence and law enforcement were trying to either smear candidate Donald Trump or hinder his campaign, and then later began to see what they can do to remove President Donald Trump from office. And so, of course, since he is an attorney general nominated individual who is appointed by Donald Trump, of course, every decision William Barr has criticized is going to come under various scrutiny. But it is interesting that he is going to be a difficult person to smear if you want to go on a public record, because as Jim Garrity says, to say that John Durham is tight-lipped is an understatement. He lets his courtroom arguments speak for him and rarely talks to reporters at all. Those who have covered him for years, or more accurately tried to cover him, say that when he does run into reporters, he is cordial but uninformative and almost never on the record. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. I found this. When he actually was being considered by the U.S. Senate for confirmation as U.S. attorney, there is a section in the questionnaire asking for a list of your written work. If you can believe this, he actually answered in that section that he had never written or published any books, articles, reports, or even letters to the editor, which I thought was pretty amazing. And he's oftentimes referred to as the Bull, which is a reputation that probably tells you a lot about the reason why he was selected by Bill Barr, or Attorney William Barr, the Attorney General, for this. And the former Attorney General, Mick McCasey, interestingly enough, had appointed him years ago to investigate the destruction of these videotapes of CIA waterboarding, if you might remember that as well. And it was interesting that even during that period of time, there were some reporters that really wanted to kind of do a profile on this individual, because this was, if nothing else, the kind of thing that the press loves. You know, can we investigate something, some misdeed that happened during the Bush administration? And interestingly enough, the reporter said, I called John Durham, to check the accuracy of the claim, and he confirmed that he knew the reporter, but made it clear and specific they had no use for personal profiles. He thinks about the work period, and that's just about it. So it seems to me that he oftentimes doesn't speak to anybody in the press, which is somewhat rare, because there are a lot of people in the Justice Department, a lot of people in intelligence, a lot of people in the bureaucracy, a lot of people in the administration that are looking for ways to puff themselves up in the press. He's not one of them. But interestingly enough, a number of years ago, he did actually give a lecture in West Hartford, Connecticut, at University of St. Joseph. And it's interesting because some reporters were there, and they said they were there because this may be the only time we have a chance to hear John Durham talk about his record. But in subsequent remarks, Jim Garrity says, Durham made it sound like his reticence to speak publicly wasn't mere shyness, so much as a deliberate strategy to serve justice. Here's one of the direct quotes from Durham. One thing that I try to bear in mind and try to encourage in new young prosecutors, particularly those who are making their bones or cutting their teeth, is the awareness of the incredible power that is wielded by law enforcement, and perhaps federal law enforcement in particular. Issuing a subpoena can destroy someone's reputation. It can damage their business, hurt their families. It is an awesome power that we have, and we should only be used in appropriate instances. It is as important for the system as for prosecutors to protect the secrecy of proceedings, not because we want them to be secret, because they're not always right. Maybe accusations that are lodged against somebody are untrue, and again, we can destroy a person if that information gets out. Oh, I wish we had people like that working in the Justice Department, working in the criminal departments of various prosecutions around the country. And so, if nothing else, it then gives you kind of a story of an individual that is now investigating some of what is taking place. And I think just a good illustration of the fact that you will probably hear his name mentioned occasionally, but you probably won't ever really hear him say very much, because that is pretty much the modus operandi for this individual, the way in which he goes about trying to address some of these issues, and he'll be very careful. So if he does issue a subpoena, you can recognize that this comes from an individual that has tried to warn other young prosecutors, be really careful, because after all, you can destroy a person's reputation just with an indictment, with a subpoena, and if it is unclear whether or not that is true, people lie sometimes, and you can ruin a reputation very quickly. So he is an individual known as the Bull, and he's the one trying to figure out how did we head down this long, tedious trail, which eventually became the investigation of Donald Trump and the 2016 election, when the connections probably are tighter to the Clinton campaign than they were to the Trump campaign. So we'll see if we can find out a little bit more. But this name, John Durham, you won't hear very often. But when you do, he's probably got some kind of blockbuster that has surfaced in terms of his investigation. Just before we take a break, let me just mention that my Viewpoints commentary today is Worldviews Through History. And it's written by a friend who we've had on this program. And I first met him in Connecticut years ago. He's a professor, Glenn Sunshine. And he has written a very good book, Why You Think the Way You Do. And it really is kind of the story of Western worldviews from Rome to home. And when I was in Israel about a week ago, and then we went from Israel to Rome, one night I actually mentioned his book, because his argument is that if you look at the Roman Empire, it was an empire that did not have compassion. And there's a reason for that. Compassion, virtue, mercy were seen as character flaws. And so on top of Rome came Christianity, where Christians valued individuals, whether they were emperors or slaves, valued individuals, whether they were male or female, valued individuals, whether they were healthy or those thrown out in the streets by the Romans. They would come and nurse them back to health. Valued young babies that were girls being thrown out in the street and would adopt them for their own. And so basically his argument is Western civilization has a Roman foundation with a, if you will, Christian superstructure. And he argues now that in the 21st century, as we're removing Christianity, we're going back to the Roman Empire. It's pretty powerful. And nothing else, it's a very good piece that we have posted on the website today called Worldviews Through History. And also, for those of you that like to read a little bit more about that, we actually turned it into a booklet that we make available to those of you that donate to Point of View. So again, you might want to check out the Truth Team, because your gift of $50 a month means you'll receive those booklets on a regular basis, along with the Outlook magazine and so much more. Let's take a break. We're going to have Robert Wolgemuth and Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth on the program right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to be talking about a lot of different topics over the next couple of hours, and I hope you'll stay with us for all of those. In the next hour, we have David Limbaugh with us as we talk about his book, Guilty by Reason of Insanity. We'll get back into some of the insanity of the political campaign, the impeachment investigation, and much more. So we'll certainly get into that in the next hour. But this hour, I thought you would really enjoy our conversation that we're going to have with Robert Wolgemuth and Nancy Wolgemuth. You might remember we had Robert on recently to talk about Lies Men Believe, and of course Nancy Lee DeMoss has written about a book about women as well. And we're going to get into this new book that has just come out. It is published by our friends at Moody Publishers. You Can Trust God to Write Your Story. And some of the story is their own story, so we'll talk about that in just a minute. Nancy Wolgemuth has touched the lives of millions of women through Revive Our Hearts and the True Woman Movement. Our books have sold more than 3 million copies. And, of course, they've been married, I guess, since 2015. And, Nancy, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's great to be with you.
And Robert Wolgemuth, of course, has been with us before. He's been in the media business for 39 years and was the former president of Thomas Nelson. Of course, we talked about Wolgemuth and Hyatt and Wolgemuth and Associates. And, Robert, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. Like Nancy said, it's great to be with you today.
Well, we're going to get into telling the story, but I guess we need to tell your story. You were married before, as we talked about the last time we had on there. Nancy, of course, has been single. But part of the story of your courtship and marriage is in this book. So maybe we could start there. Robert, what would you share?
How much time do you have, Kerby? Do we have an hour or do we have more than an hour?
I think we got an hour, but I know it's an interesting story, and you only found out after you guys were engaged something that your former wife had said before she died. And anyway, you wanted to tell the rest of the story because we've always enjoyed this. It's a great story.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Bobby and I were married for almost 45 years. I met Nancy in 2003 as her literary agent. I had the privilege of working with her professionally, and so then she and Bobby met and didn't become close friends, but close enough friends. They shared a password, Hymn Lady, because they both loved the old hymns. And then Bobby was diagnosed stage 4 ovarian cancer in 2012. And then 2.5 years later, just before she stepped into heaven, she told 2 friends that I want Robert to remarry, and they said, we've heard you tell us that many times, but she said there's something else. I want Robert to marry Nancy Lee DeMoss.
Yes.
That was the first time they had heard that. And Nancy did not tell me, Bobby did not tell me that. So actually it was a couple of months after Nancy and I were dating that those 2 friends stepped forward and said, there's something you probably ought to know. And so if I had known before, it could have felt like an assignment, but because I didn't and found out after Nancy and I were dating, that it felt like a confirmation from the Lord. So that is a true story. That's the way it happened.
Well, Nancy, I'm going to come to you for just a minute, because if I remember the story right, you actually fired a person that ended up being your husband.
You have a good memory, Kerby.
That's such a wonderful story.
I'm probably the only author to hire, fire, and marry her agent.
Some guys will do anything to get a client back, right?
It is such a great story. Well, again, that's part of the book, of course, and people can read a little bit more about that. But Nancy, let me come to you for just a minute because, of course, this is also a great foreword by Johnny Erickson Tata, which I enjoyed her foreword as well. But the kind of the idea here is, and I've said this on the program many times before, everybody has a story, but they don't realize it. And in some respects, you take those stories and then weave them into stories about Esther, about Naomi and Ruth, about Joseph and others, and apply some of that to whatever life stage you might be in, whatever circumstance you might find yourself, and recognize that in even the difficult sets of circumstances, we can see God's providence.
Yes, well summarized. And, at any given moment, all we can see is this moment. We can't see what lies ahead. We can't see what God has in store for us. And we live, all of us, in areas of our lives in messy places. It's a fallen, broken world. There is pain, there is hurt worldwide, but also in the microcosm of our lives. And the freedom comes when we say, look, I don't have to control this story. I can't control this story. But we have a wise and loving and faithful and good God who knows exactly what is going on, not only knows it, but is orchestrating all the events of this world, from the macro to the micro, down to the tiniest atomic details of our lives. He's orchestrating this for a story he's writing, the story of redemption, making all things new. And God is doing that in our lives, even in the hard, inexplicable places. And so we walk by faith. If we were to write our own story, we would want trouble-free, pain-free, no problems.
Boring,
exactly. But, we look at somebody like a Johnny Erickson Tata, who's had a life of a lot of pain, in a wheelchair for over 50 years now as a quadriplegic. And we look at her and we say, this is an amazing woman with huge faith and beautiful spirit. And you get around Johnny and you think, boy, I'd like to have the kind of relationship with Jesus that she does. And I'd like to have the kind of mature faith that she does. But then we think, Lord, don't give me anything hard. That might be part of the story to get me there. And God knows exactly what it takes in each of our lives to end up with that beautiful and good story that is what he's all about.
Chapter 10 is about Joseph, and I've been preaching through our whole Sunday school class at Prestonwood, have been teaching through Joseph, and there is no one long trajectory there from the pit to the palace. There are ups and downs all through that. And so whether you're looking at Esther or Naomi and Ruth, whether you're looking at Joseph or a variety of other, even Mary and Joseph later on, you are talking about individuals whose lives reflect reality. If we were to write a story, it would just be onward and upward, no challenges, no setbacks. And yet the reality is that most of us are going to deal with one of the chapters in the book, if not all of them, on marriage, about health, about if your child breaks your heart, if you lose a loved one, eventually if you're facing death. And so this book is really intended, isn't it, Robert, I think, for almost any of our listeners today.
It's true. And we put the Bible stories in there, Kerby, because there's certainly a timelessness to it. It's out of God's inspired and holy word. But then you read a story like Joseph that you just mentioned, and we look at that story and we see it in its totality. But imagine if we had been there with Joseph, or if we were Joseph. And so, we're in the pit, literally, and thinking that we're going to die down there and trying to figure out what our next step is going to be. Well, we read the story. We see it in its entirety. We get all the way to chapter 50, and we see Joseph's perspective that these men, his brothers, meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So the things that we encounter in our own lives, and certainly the stories that we were able to share in this book, are a picture of that. In some cases, it looks like evil and chaos and pain, but at the end of the day, the Lord knows exactly what he's doing. And our task, if you would, is to trust him as this story is being written in our own lives.
Very good. Let's take a break. And again, about 16 different chapters. We'll cover some of that material. If you go to our website, you will see that we have a link to Robert Wolgemuth's website. We have a link to Revive Our Hearts. Of course, this is published by Moody. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we even have a link there as well. We'll work our way through a few of the chapters. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We often talk about worldviews, but do we know how they were formed through history? Professor Glenn Sunshine wrote a great book entitled Why You Think the Way You Do, the story of Western worldviews from Rome to home. It helps us see the influence of worldviews through history, and he defines a worldview as the framework you use to interpret the world and your place in it. He begins by discussing the worldview of Rome, and by the end of the book, we return to the same worldview. Western civilization is a product of ancient Roman civilization plus Christianity. Glenn Sunshine argues that once you remove Christianity, the modern world reverted back to Roman society and a recovery of the ancient pagan worldview. Like Rome, we value toleration as the supreme virtue. The Romans lived in an oversexed society. So was our society. Rome practiced abortion. So does our society. Rome was antinatal and made a deliberate attempt to prevent pregnancy. They focused on sexual enjoyment and did not want to bother with kids. In our modern world, birth rates in most of the Western democracies are plummeting. So how should Christians live in this world? Of course, we should live out a biblical worldview. Every generation is called to live faithfully to the gospel, and our generation is no exception. From history, we can see that the early church did live faithfully and transformed the Roman world. Christians produced a totally new civilization, Western culture. By living faithfully before the watching world, we will increase our credibility and earn the respect from those around us by living in accordance with biblical principles. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We have with us today Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth and Robert Wolgemuth, and as we talk about the book, You Can Trust God to Write Your Story, forward by Johnny Erickson Tata, and a number of chapters on You Can Trust God when your marriage is in trouble, when you long for a mate, when you're pressed financially, when you lose your health, when you've been sinned against, and many others. And so, again, we're going to work through just a few of the chapters, but about 200 pages, great material. We have a link to both of their websites. And, of course, if you can't find this book in your local bookstore, though we encourage you to buy it in your local bookstore, we also have a link both in hardback and Kindle. Robert, let me just maybe pick out a chapter or two for each one of you. Chapter 4, You Can Trust God When Your Marriage is in Trouble. Not that I'm saying your marriage was, but as an individual who was married longer than just Nancy in 2015, you have certainly over these years run into fellow Christians whose marriages were in trouble. And it is the best time, I think, for us to trust in God and for His provision in our lives.
It's true. You know, when Nancy and I were dating, Nancy said, you know, people keep saying marriage is hard work. You know, would it be possible, will it be possible to get married and not have to say it's hard work? And I would say we have a lovely marriage. Let me just say that at 67, that's me, and Nancy at 57, you know, we were grown-ups. You know, a lot of young people get married in their early 20s, and I understand that. But they do a lot of growing up side by side, right? A lot of learning to do. But at 67 and 57, let's just say that we were grown-ups. And so a lot of our struggles were not as high energy as maybe some younger couples who get married and face conflict and so forth. But yeah, it's, you know, you have two sinful people living under the same roof, lots and lots of differences. In fact, Nancy and I were at a meeting last night, and a couple did this back and forth he likes, she likes, he likes. It was hilarious. And we decided to come up with our own list because every couple has these. One of the things we didn't talk about before we got married was, are you a morning person or a night person?
I remember you sharing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And your line is, well, we'll work it out. We'll figure it out.
Exactly. You've got a great memory, man. So, but yeah, it is. Marriage is a lot of hard work, and it's actually, the purpose of marriage is not to make us happy, but to make us holy. There's something sanctifying about the whole process of humbly loving and serving each other in a way that pleases the Lord and pleases each other. So, yes, it is a challenge. It is always a challenge. Your listeners would put their hands in the air and say, yeah, marriage, a good marriage is hard work. An average marriage, so-so marriage, maybe not so hard. But if you're committed to a great marriage that honors each other, that honors the Lord, it takes a lot of work, a lot of sacrifice and humility. But it's always worth it. I mean, our joy in this marriage, and it's going to be 4 years next week, which is amazing when you think about it.
Yes.
We actually we count months.
Yes, I know you do.
We've completed our 47th anniversary, and so next week will be our 48th. But it is a huge celebration. It's an amazing gift of God's providence and kindness to us. We say to each other often, you are exactly what I needed.
And, honey, in this book, we talked with and told the stories of people who've been in really, really difficult marriages.
Yes.
And there are probably as many people listening to this conversation who may be in some kind of difficult marriage as those who would say it's going great. And, in a couple of cases, we told stories of people how God supernaturally intervened to rescue a hopeless marriage. But then there are other stories where the redemption has not yet been seen,
right,
where they're still living in the difficulty, the marriage that hasn't been repaired, but how to trust God when your eyes are filled with tears, when you cannot see an answer, when you can't change the other person, when you can't fix the problem, and all you can do is trust God to be who you need and what you need when your mate isn't meeting your need or isn't interested in staying in that marriage. So there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain globally in our world. There's a lot of pain in people's hearts and relationships. And we didn't want to just tell pretty stories or stories that have a nice bow tied around them and they all lived happily ever after. That's not yet. That's not now. And so how can we find joy? And how can we have the peace of Christ? How can we experience a daily infusion of his grace when our heart is aching? Those are the kinds of hard stories that we talked about and where we saw people trusting God with the mysteries of his providence.
Very good.
We talked to a couple whose child is far away from home and a prodigal. Well, that's not just about that kid. It's about pressure on the marriage in dealing with all of that. So some of the chapters that deal with other things often go back to this whole struggle about what do you do in a marriage when things aren't going well outside your marriage, with your children, with your health, all kinds of circumstances, like you lose your job or you lose all your financial means. All those things have tremendous consequences in your marriage, and we talk about that too.
Yeah. Chapter 11, when you can trust God when your child breaks your heart, also comes back to, of course, chapter 4, you can trust God when your marriage is in trouble. But let me go to chapter 5, because it's you can trust God when you long for a mate. And early on in the book, Nancy, it says that you were a great champion of marriage and your ministry, but you also had a sense of calling to serve the Lord as a single woman. But you know as well as I do that because you were a single woman, I probably would have mentioned that you had other women coming up saying, I really would like a husband. I'm glad that you feel that you have the gift of celibacy, of singleness, but I want this individual to come and love me. I have never been able to find Prince Charming. What would you say to those individuals?
Well, you can trust God with every unfulfilled longing, and we all have them. And it's been such a beautiful thing to me. I've got a number of colleagues in our ministry who are women who in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and older, that God hasn't sent that, forget the Prince Charming, just a good man and a man who loves the Lord.
Yes.
And that's the desire of their heart. And I've watched some of these women do this with such grace and say, Lord, marriage is not an idol. It is not a right. It's a gift. And if you choose to give me that gift, I will receive it with joy. If you don't, I'm going to be thankful and I'm going to serve you. That's a hard thing for a woman in particular, I think, to lay down that right, that longing to marriage. I have to tell you a sweet story, though. One of the women the stories we wrote about in that chapter, she's served with me in this ministry for many years, in her early 50s, and as the book was going to press, the Lord brought a widowed pastor into her life, and she is getting married on Thanksgiving Day.
Wow.
Never anticipated that God would have this chapter for her. And so you say, yeah, well, that's good for her. That didn't happen to me. But here she was living for all these years as a woman trusting God when she did not see any sign of this ever happening. And, it's trusting God not only with your story, but with the stories of others. You talk about when your child breaks your heart. I don't want to skip over that too quickly because that is such a huge, pressing pain in so many parents' hearts. And so it's trusting God not only to write your own story, but also trusting God to write the story of those you love, or the story of that husband who hasn't shown up yet. It's trusting God to work in this world to bring about His glorious kingdom purposes in His way and in His timing. So on every front, marriage, family, politics, government, world affairs, this principle applies through all of the universe, that it's God who keeps this earth and the sun and the moon and the stars in their places, who created it all, who keeps it all functioning and sustained and going. But it's God also who keeps our lives sustained and who fulfills our deepest longings with Himself, and till we find out that He really is enough, even in those hard, inexplicable places of our journeys.
Well, we'll take a break, and when we come back, maybe we'll focus a little bit of time on attention on you can trust God when your child breaks your heart. I know that is certainly a longing of many parents, and we'll get into a couple of the other chapters on when you've lost a loved one or when someone has sinned against you, you lose your health. There's so many very powerful chapters here. But let me just mention we also have a link to Robert Wolgemuth's website, as well as to Revive Our Hearts. And as you go maybe to the website during the break, you'll notice that one of the other things that Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth has provided is a 31-day Advent devotional to keep Christ in the center this Christmas with Consider Jesus. So that is another resource that you can find at reviveourhearts.com. And of course, we have a link to all of those websites, as well as if you can't find this book in your local bookstore, and I would imagine you would, then we have a link so that you can get it in hardback or in Kindle. So we'll continue our conversation with them, and there are certainly a number of other chapters that we will try to delve into. But when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about those prodigal children that break our hearts, and then maybe a few other lessons we can learn as we begin to think about how those patriarchs address these issues, how those heroes in the Scriptures address them, and then how even our contemporaries are addressing these issues from a biblical point of view. All that coming up right after this.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again with Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth and Robert Wolgemuth. You can trust God to write your story. And just before I get back to the book, one of the things we always like to do at the kind of the bottom of the hour is feature the various websites. So, Robert, let me come to you first, robertwolgemuth.com. There is a place for people to read your blog, to sign up for your blog. Of course, we also have a link to your Twitter feed and many of your books. And if you don't know how to spell his last name, good news is it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Nancy's probably had to spell her last name a little bit more in the last couple of years than she did before, but nevertheless, Robert, it is resources that are available. And I mentioned just a few minutes ago when we had such a great conversation with you, Lies Men Believe, but many of your other books are available on your website, aren't they?
They are. Thank you. And how kind of you to say that. Yes, Lies Men Believe was the last book before You Can Trust God to Write Your Story, and that was a great privilege to write because it followed Nancy's Lies Women Believe, which has sold over 1 million copies.
Yes.
So it's been great fun to do all this together with my precious wife.
The other one, of course, is we have reviveyourhearts.com. Now, Nancy, just a minute ago, I mentioned the book because that is a nice devotional for people, but for your blog, for your studies, leadership material, there's just a great number of resources. And so could you, for just a minute, talk about everything available at reviveyourhearts.com?
Yes, actually, it's Revive Our Hearts.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because we all need it. No, that's just fine. And we have a daily broadcast, podcast. It's our mission is calling women to freedom, fullness, and fruitfulness in Christ. So we're just pointing women to Jesus. And when our hearts get filled with Him, that impacts everyone else around us. So we have the daily content, the daily blogs, and a lot of resources like this new Advent devotional, the second one, a new one this year from the one we did last year, and it's called Consider Jesus, and it's the month of December, just 31 days of soaking in who He is and why He came, what a difference He makes in our lives. So lots of resources available, particularly for women in every season of life, there at reviveourhearts.com.
And again, you can go to pointofview.net in case you didn't have a chance to write all those down, and those are going to be available to you. But let's come to chapter 11, because perhaps one of the best-known parables by Jesus is, of course, the story of the prodigal son. And you have a lost coin, lost sheep, lost son. But very quickly you move from that story to some very powerful stories and really difficult stories of what parents have faced with their children who stray from the faith. Share a little bit more if you might.
Yeah, actually, every night before we go to sleep, Kerby, we pray through a list of folks we love, family members and so forth, but we also pray for 11 young men. 2 of those men are prodigals, and we know and love their parents deeply.
Wow.
And the truth is, both of those men are still prodigals. So this is an ongoing challenge for these parents who have prayed like crazy. You know, they do not say that they've been perfect parents, but in this situation, they're out of options. And so, in fact, just imagine the priceless gift these people gave us as we interviewed them for this book. And there were tears and transparency in terms of confession of things that they did do wrong and would do differently. But at the end of the day, trusting God to move in the hearts of these, in both these cases, men, young men who are far, far away from home. You know, the parents have lost control. There's nothing they can do. And like the father in the prodigal son, what you do is you pray that your child would come to their senses. That's the most powerful moment in that story is when the young man comes to his own senses. And that's what you pray for. You pray, and we do every night for these men. Again, as I said, several of them gone away from home as prodigals. But you pray that the Holy Spirit will communicate them to them through other people, through circumstances, whatever it takes, Lord. Bring these young men to yourself and bring them home.
Here's a little something, Kerby, I think that might be encouraging to parents who are in that place today, which is a lot of parents.
Mm-hmm.
But one of these dads shared with us 3 things that they had concluded as they wrestled through a child who grew up in the faith, made strong profession of faith for years and then walked away in every way imaginable. But he said, number one, we've realized we cannot change his heart. Only God can do that. We can't make that happen. Number two, it's not our responsibility to fix our son. And these parents talked about how that was kind of their natural bent was, we're born fixers. And they felt we got to do something to change this or to get him back. And he said, we realized we can't change his heart, and it's not our responsibility to change him. And then number three, we can't quit. We have to continue loving our son, praying for him, not giving up on God, not giving up on him. And I think for parents to realize that God is writing a story, not only in your life, but in the lives of those you love. And you can't write it, you can't change it, you can't fix it, but God is writing the story, and you can trust him that he's the one who can capture their hearts. And you don't quit, but you don't also, put God in a box where you say, Lord, you have to do it my way or in my timing or make this happen or that happen. God is God. We are not. And so we trust him. We say, Lord, you love these children more than we possibly could as parents. And we're going to trust you to do what is right in their hearts. And we'll keep praying. We'll keep pleading. We talked with some parents. One of the young men that we've prayed for now years, we were with his parents recently, not one of the prodigals, but a young man who's grown up in a Christian home and doesn't know Jesus and has not been open to the gospel. And we were with his parents recently, and we said, we still pray for your son. And they said, God is changing him. God's drawing his heart. God's working on him. He's coming to church now. And we don't know what that story is going to look like. Get some praying friends around you, and then trust that God can do what you can't in those kids' hearts.
Very good. And again, let's encourage all of our listeners to pray for other prodigals that you may be aware of. And what a great testimony of what Nancy and Robert pray every single night before Robert knocks off, because I know he's an early riser. I love the line there. He says, he's there until about amen, and he's gone, because I can understand that as well. But let's just, before we go any further, talk about one other issue, and that's chapter 8. You can trust God when you lose your health. Or to even broaden it, I remember one time Billy Graham said something like, I was prepared for anything in ministry, but not aging. I didn't really think about what that would mean. And for those of us that are getting a little bit older, I'm Robert's age, so we can relate to that very easily, and I think some of our listeners can, whether it's you lose your health through some kind of acute situation or something that's just chronic, we're just getting older, that's another place where we need to learn to trust God, isn't it?
Well, it's so true. In fact, most of the stories in the book, Kerby, are we don't record the names, the actual names of the people, just to protect their identity. But one of the stories we do tell, and we got permission to do this, but a man who worked with Nancy in ministry for many, many years, John Reeford, he and his wife Tammy, again, friends for decades, and John was diagnosed with prostate cancer.
Yes.
Stage 4 prostate cancer. And so Nancy and I went to visit John and Tammy, and we tell that story in the book, in that chapter. And we sat with these dear people. John's in a recliner, his feet are elevated, and I'm saying to John, what does this feel like? Pretend that you're me, right? And you're telling me what this is like. What does it feel like to be on the threshold of heaven? And John's answers were so sweet. Of course, we recorded them in that chapter.
And, honey, can I just interject here that we had watched John from the early diagnosis, not knowing what the outcome would be. We'd watched them with this illness, walk through that, and now when we were at their house, this incident that Robert's talking about, he knew that he was close to death, close to going home. And we watched during the sickness and then during the last, all the way up to the end of his life. We watched that couple living out the message of this book, trusting God with their future, with their health, with now 3 weeks later, we were sitting at John Reeford's funeral after that conversation. And now I ran into his wife, was it yesterday or today? Yesterday, and she's a widow now, she's quite a bit younger than he was, and we've watched them in this. Who would write the script that way? No one. In fact, John had lost a wife. His first wife died suddenly of an aneurysm after they'd been married, I think, just 18 months, many years ago. So he had been through a lot. His wife has been through a lot. But we watched them just clinging with raw, naked faith to Jesus.
Very good.
Saying, God is good. God is faithful. We trust him. We wouldn't write it this way, but God's good. And actually, at John's funeral, a video clip was played of an interview he had done with our staff months earlier, where he talked about facing illness, facing death, and saying God is good no matter what.
Again, Chapter 8 on You Can Trust God When You Lose Your Health, and also You Can Trust God When You're Facing Death. We'll cover a little bit more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about the book, You Can Trust God to Write Your Story. And Nancy and Robert, for just a minute, let's go to chapter 16, because you talk about you can trust God, you really can. And I'd like to use these last few minutes to talk about how people can use this book in a way to, in a sense, write their story, but also, more importantly, how this is a book that could be used for certainly individual study. I can see a lot of people want to just read through this on their own, but also how this could just be a great opportunity for outreach. You could have a small group study on this. If you know people right now going through a health reversal, a financial reversal, they've got a prodigal child, whatever the issue might be, this book covers so many different parts of some of the challenges we face in life. So talk, if you would, for just a few minutes about how to use this book in ministry.
Well, you're exactly right. In fact, there are very few people that we know who aren't going through one of these situations. I mean, none of us has been exempted from this kind of pain and struggle here on
And
earth.
if they aren't now, they will be.
They will be, that's right. So the point of the book, several things. One is to turn them back to the Word of God. We did not want to write a book that didn't include something from the Word so that people could go back to God's Word and be encouraged by things that happened to real people. You know, you take the story of Joseph. Well, he didn't know that eventually he would become number 2 in the land of Egypt. He thought he was a kid wearing a colorful jacket in the bottom of a pit. He had no idea. So, everybody that you and I know, across the board, as Nancy said, either they're in it or they're about to get in it. One of these chapters is going to fit their situation. And so what we've done is we've done our best to be encouraging, but not some kind of fake, rah-rah, you can get through this kind of thing, but really substantiated by the Word of God and by His promises. In fact, when Nancy and I sign books for folks, we write Romans chapter 11, verses 33 to 35. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable His judgments and His paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been His counselor? So this is the truth of God's Word. And knowing that we're looking through a veil, right? And we won't know, 1 Corinthians 13, until we see Him face to face, what this is really all about, for sure. But we can trust that at the end of our lives, we will look back, and see God's hand traced through the circumstances that we have faced through our lives.
And I would just add, too, Kerby, that I think the best preparation for coming to those hard places, those difficult chapters, is to get to know God now. When things seem fine, to get to know His character, His ways, His heart, His word, and then you come to that inexplicable place, that valley, that difficult passageway, that painful chapter, and you're going to have a track record with God. God's got a track record with you. And we look back on our lives and we see how faithful He has been and that He has been trustworthy. He has proven Himself. And then when the hard things come, and they lie ahead, more of them for all of us, then we can say, Lord, You've proven Yourself over and over again, and I know You're going to be faithful in this situation I'm facing now.
And how God uses our hard situations for His glory. Chapter 9, we talk about a couple. The man confessed to his wife a lifetime of pornography addiction, and their story now is incredible. How God has used that hard place to redeem, to sanctify both this husband and this wife, and then to give them the chance to minister to others who are caught. And as you know, there are so many couples who are facing this.
Oh, yes.
To be redeeming in the lives of other people. So God has used that story to help others.
I want to pick up on one other point, and the subtitle is Embracing the Mysteries of Providence. And it is kind of striking, Nancy, if nothing else, that as you talk about in chapter 2, that even though one of the few books where God is not mentioned is the book of Esther, but it may be one of the best illustrations in the Old Testament of the providence of God. So sometimes we don't see the providence of God, maybe only in the rearview mirror as we look back over our lives.
Yes, and in that book of Esther, God's fingerprints are everywhere, and you can see it when you read it. Esther didn't see it in the moment, but how God turns the tables, and those, the wicked seem to prosper, those who are seeking the Lord seem to get in trouble, but in the end, God says He will judge the wicked, and He will redeem and rescue those who trust Him and those who seek Him. So you can't measure God's providence by what you're seeing or experiencing right now. You trust that in the end, God will make all things right. He will not only write your story, W-R-I-T-E, but He will write, R-I-G-H-T, your story. And that's true of people. It's true of families. It's true of nations. It's true in this world. I've been living in the Old Testament prophets over the last few months here, and you see that in the end, God will bring justice and righteousness to bear in this world. So while everything seems to be in chaos and falling apart and the wicked winning, you can trust that God is writing His story in this world. He will have the final word, the final say, and it will be a good story.
Yeah, and thank you, Kerby, for being a champion for that point of view, pun intended, in terms of encouraging people who are looking at the daily news feed and don't know what to do, freaking out. Yeah. And you're encouraging them. What a huge gift this is to the church. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Thank you. One last time, reviveourhearts.com is a great resource. You might want to find out more not only about this book, but about that 31-day Advent devotional. Of course, the lies women believe, the lies men believe. We, of course, have a link to robertwolgemuth.com. And if nothing else, let me very quickly say happy anniversary. For those of us that trust anniversaries on years rather than months like you've been doing, happy anniversary ahead of time.
Thank you, Kerby.
Grateful for you.
Grateful for you both, and thank you for joining us today. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of those hard stories that we talk about in the news, and they are going to be pretty significant. David Limbaugh will be with us, and of course, over the last few years, he's been writing some books that have more of a religious tone to them, so this one, he gets back to some of the political evaluation. As I said on our Friday weekend edition, David Limbaugh, a couple of years ago, came out with a book called Persecution, and it was such a great book because it pulled together all the stories of ways in which religious liberty had been challenged in the court. So it really provided an opportunity if somebody says, well, I don't think there's that much of a threat to religious liberty, you can hand them almost a 300-page book and say, well, look at these. Well, this book is the same kind of way. It's over 300 pages, and in typical David Limbaugh style, 80 pages of endnotes. My goodness, he's done a lot of research. But it really documents some of the insanity that's unfolding before our very eyes right now. And so we are going to be talking about some of the ideas that are being put forward, and whether it's the Green New Deal or Medicare for All. We're going to get into some things we've never really talked about before, like critical race theory. Of course, the article that we've posted by him exposing the fraud of socialism is kind of a short summary of 2 chapters in the book, and that is something we've addressed before, the whole idea of capitalism versus socialism. So I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation, and I'm going to open up the phones a little bit later that hour, so if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Obviously, David Limbaugh is a best-selling author and is quite willing to kind of have a give and take on some of these issues. So we'll get a chance to hear from him and then give you a chance to join the conversation as well. If you'd like to know more about any of the books or resources we've been talking about today, I would encourage you to go to the website pointofview.net. The first article I've posted here is really kind of a good disclaimer about not trusting all of the polling that's been coming out recently on impeachment. The second article, The Fraud of Socialism, is a very good piece by David Limbaugh that I think you could pass on to maybe a young person that's convinced that socialism is better than capitalism. And, of course, these 2 books, You Can Trust God to Write Your Story, and, of course, coming up, Guilty by Reason of Insanity. All that coming up right after this.
So when people first hear about Medishare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medishare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medishare members? 2 big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medishare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
As we've been promoting, we now have David Limbaugh with us as we talk about his book, Guilty by Reason of Insanity. And in the past, we certainly have appreciated some of his books, Crimes Against Liberty. I mentioned just the other day when we had Kelly Shackelford on his book, Persecution, which actually pulled together all these different threats against religious liberty and how valuable that was, and kind of having it in one particular resource. This book is almost 500 pages, about 80 pages of endnotes in typical David Limbaugh style. We've enjoyed, of course, talking to him in the past about some of his books dealing with the Bible and biblical interpretation, but he returns back to this issue of politics. We're going to talk about everything from critical race theory to the Green New Deal. Matter of fact, one of the articles we've posted is David Limbaugh's commentary, Exposing the Fraud of Socialism. Two of his chapters are on the subject of socialism. And David Limbaugh, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, thank you for having me.
We would love to get into these topics, and let me talk about socialism for just a minute, because your column came out the other day, two of your chapters on this subject, and the bottom line is we've been documenting this on Point of View for now decades. The younger you are, the more likely you are to accept socialism or to believe that socialism is better than capitalism. And that's because a lot of young people were not around when we had the Soviet Union. They look at maybe Venezuela as an outlier. They maybe think Sweden is socialist, none of which is true. And that's why you devoted 2 whole chapters in your book just to address that issue of socialism.
Versus capitalism. They're flip sides of the same coin. And what we need to remember is that part of that one factor in the left and young people being enamored with socialism is that the left has successfully demonized capitalism. And so even if they would buy into some of our ideas about capitalism and socialism, they would have to be persuaded that capitalism wasn't as evil as they've been indoctrinated to believe in the schools. So I not only devote 2 chapters to critiquing socialism and capitalism morally and intellectually, but in the third chapter, I discuss their various socialistic plans, the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, and the rest of it. So in a sense, I devote 3 chapters to this insanity.
Let's talk about that Green New Deal. We'll jump to the specific first, and we'll jump back to the philosophy, because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as you talk about, has put that forward. I think any fair-minded individual that is willing to just look at the economic issues and the social implications of that would say that this is the most wrong-headed idea, but somehow it still has currency with a lot of young people and hasn't been overtly criticized by the media. Can you speak to that issue for just a minute?
Yeah, the Green New Deal, depending on how broadly you define it, encompasses so many things. In Medicare for All, a guaranteed national income, exorbitant increased income taxes, a wealth tax, and, of course, the environmental mania. And we're talking $50 trillion, some have estimated, $70 trillion, the cost of this thing. Medicare for All itself is so ridiculous that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are arguing about how it could be funded, and Bernie Sanders insists that there would have to be a substantial tax on the middle class to fund it. Elizabeth Warren is lying about it, saying that the only people that will be taxed are billionaires. And yet, if you would confiscate the wealth of all billionaires in the United States, you couldn't run that crazy Medicare for All program for 2 years. So the left is so dishonest and so irresponsible. But, it's no surprise that, going back to your point about the young people accepting it, they've been indoctrinated, bombarded by academia, by the media, and by Hollywood about how evil capitalism is. There are, I would say, in 60% of the colleges in the United States, universities, very few conservatives and Republicans. In 40% of the colleges, there are zero Republicans.
Yeah.
So they don't promote a diversity of ideas. So you get constant bombardment with the history textbooks, Howard Zinn's People's History of America, and the American Pageant, which is the most popular history textbook. They talk about the robber barons and the railroads and how evil our founding was and capitalistic. And so it's really no surprise that we have a bunch of young people who have fallen into the lie. And as you say, they're unfamiliar with the history of communist schemes in the 20th century, which are responsible for 100 million murders of their own citizens. It's just amazing.
And on the other side, again, they are probably unaware of the fact, and even Bono recently talked about, I got to admit, and I think he was somewhat reluctantly admit, that capitalism, the free market, has risen, been able to raise at least 1 billion people out of abject poverty. And we're going to get to the point where if this trend continues, there will be no more so-called extreme poverty in the world. And that comes from a free market. It doesn't come from a top-down socialist or Marxist idea, does it?
Yeah. No. In fact, for the entirety of human history, until about 200 years ago, prior to the introduction of free markets, we had poverty. And we also had income inequality. The rulers had the money, and the ruled had no money. And it was only after the free markets have uplifted people out of poverty into prosperity. But now you see, from a Christian perspective, from a biblical perspective, what we see the left doing. They're not satisfied with the fact that we've had overall enormous increases in the standard of living. What they want to do is pit people against each other and talk about class warfare and violate the 10th commandment against covetousness and get us all thinking about how much the other guy has. It doesn't matter if you have TV, car, phone, all these things. Our poorest people in America, some of them, many of them, have all these things. So there's nothing like the poverty there was in elsewhere on the globe. I mean, in certain third world places, or in the past, nobody had any of these kind of luxuries, and now almost everyone does. And so all they can do is complain about how much some people have more than other people, demonizing corporations. I saw this Sally Cohn, who's a leftist. She had an article in Real Clear Politics today talking about how Elizabeth Warren wants to save capitalism, and she should be nominated by the Democrats because she's a real capitalist. She just wants to reduce income inequality. It's just so absurd. Under socialist systems, the only way you reduce income inequality is by spreading the misery, stopping growth, shrinking the economic pie, and then have the central planners redistribute. And the reason, Kerby, is that the central planners are omniscient enough to make these decisions that the invisible hand of the market is responsible for making.
Well, let's take a break, and we'll continue our conversation with David Limbaugh. When we come back, we're going to talk about victimhood and the victimhood hierarchy and intersectionality and some words that maybe you've heard before. We'll talk about a critical race theory. We'll talk about race mania, the gender madness, to mention just a few, and a variety of other examples. And a little bit later, we'll get into leftist intolerance and so much more. It's all part of this new book, his 10th book with Regnery, Guilty by Reason of Insanity. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
We often talk about worldviews, but do we know how they were formed through history? Professor Glenn Sunshine wrote a great book entitled Why You Think the Way You Do, The Story of Western Worldviews from Rome to Home. It helps us see the influence of worldviews through history, and he defines a worldview as the framework you use to interpret the world and your place in it. He begins by discussing the worldview of Rome, and by the end of the book, we return to the same worldview. Western civilization is a product of ancient Roman civilization plus Christianity. Glenn Sunshine argues that once you remove Christianity, the modern world reverted back to Roman society and a recovery of the ancient pagan worldview. Like Rome, we value toleration as the supreme virtue. The Romans lived in an oversexed society. So was our society. Rome practiced abortion. So does our society. Rome was anti-natal and made a deliberate attempt to prevent pregnancy. They focused on sexual enjoyment and did not want to bother with kids. In our modern world, birth rates in most of the Western democracies are plummeting. So how should Christians live in this world? Of course, we should live out a biblical worldview. Every generation is called to live faithfully to the gospel, and our generation is no exception. From history, we can see that the early church did live faithfully and transformed the Roman world. Christians produced a totally new civilization, Western culture. By living faithfully before the watching world, we will increase our credibility and earn the respect from those around us by living in accordance with biblical principles. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you've ever listened to Point of View for a length of time, you know that oftentimes we do a teaching, and when we do that, we sometimes educate you about some of the words that we hear in the media, or maybe you hear on college campuses and want to know what they are. David Limbaugh with us, guilty by reason of insanity, and I thought for a minute, David, maybe you could talk about this idea of intersectionality, because that's what in your chapter on victimhood hierarchy is a really important idea, and young people going off to college sometimes run into that, but it's a word that helps us understand a little bit of why you have some of the kind of statements being made right now, and even some of these political debates and discussions by the Democratic Party for the presidency.
Yes, intersectionality is this crazy leftist idea that we have multiple oppressions, multiple categories of oppression: gender, race, sex, age, and all that. So that you can no longer look, by the way, they play identity politics on everything, but it's no longer just looking at the disadvantages that the African American community have experienced and the oppression they experience. No, you have to look at there are multiple oppressions, so that a black person has oppression, but so do females. So a black female, you look at the intersection of their categories of oppression, the combination of oppressions that impact them. So a black female has more historical oppression than a white female or a black male. So you have to. It's not just bean counting. It's not just looking at everybody by the color of their skin, which is just as rejecting the Martin Luther King legacy. It is looking at all of it. So we have to look at if they're a transgender black female, they're even further down the list. And so those people who have experienced the most oppression are entitled to the most protection, legally and culturally. And so we've got these people constantly looking at people in terms of what their race and gender and all that is, instead of looking at everyone as a human being created by God with equal dignity to every other human being. It is really an oppressive thing. And it is all tied together with the white privilege and critical race theory, which I guess you're going to ask me about.
Well, it certainly was, but I just thought I'd use as an illustration. You do have a quote there where CNN's Don Lemon, oh boy, what an interesting individual, questioned whether or not Kamala Harris is black enough, since after all, she has an Indian mother and Jamaican father. And you have that kind of almost mindset because you're not further down the list. But let's get into that, because critical race theory has led to them now even saying that even mathematics, and I always thought 2 + 2 always equaled 4, but I guess not. Some mathematics is also white supremacist. And talk about this idea of critical race theory, because that's, again, something that's probably new to our listeners, and you really devote a chapter to it in your book.
Yeah, and by the way, with this intersectionality, a thing that accompanies it, an idea that accompanies it, is that you can't even advocate for blacks properly if you're not a black. You've got to be, the leaders have to be made up of people who have these minorities, have these identities. Critical race theory, in a nutshell, which has been matriculating in college campuses since late 70s, I think, or maybe 80s, talks about how race is systemic, so that we no longer look at how people treat people of other races. We don't look at the content of their character or their conduct or their heart. We look at what color they are. So if you're white, you by definition are probably going to be a racist, or at least you are in a position of privilege, and so you enjoy these privileges, and you are necessarily in a position of superiority to blacks culturally and legally, and therefore blacks are entitled to protection. Well, this is very convenient for the political left, because they always need a dependency class. They always need victims and victimizers. So it doesn't matter how you atone. It doesn't matter if you fight a civil war and lose all kinds of people to eradicate slavery. Now they want reparations. If we have reparations, an idea that I consider preposterous, but if they have reparations, then they won't be satisfied with that, because by definition, you can't ever eliminate the historical effects of racism, and they're always going to be with us, and so people are always going to be mad at each other. Here's the common thread that runs throughout these leftist ideas. They are divisive. They're polarizing. They pit people against each other. Feminists pit women against men. Transgender gender ideology pits people against people who don't have these ideas. They want us at each other's throats on class, sex, race, and everything else. There can be no harmony if you subscribe to the ideology of the left. It is so destructive and so negative in terms of human nature that we just have to oppose it.
One of the interesting aspects of some of the chapters in your book is it helps explain why the other day the New York Times was lamenting the front runners in the Democrat Party right now, because there are no African Americans, no Somalians, whatever it might be. They're either white men or, in one case, a white woman, who I guess says she has some Indian ancestry, but nevertheless, wanting to be the party of diversity, the leads candidates, with the exception of one that calls himself homosexual, there is really nothing that puts you in the victimhood category very easily other than one woman. And so that even illustrates why there is such a lamenting and a hand-wringing on the part of some of the editors of the New York Times.
Do you know how preposterous it is to suggest that you have to be of a certain identity in order to lead a political movement that helps people of certain identities? Look at Wilberforce and Abraham Lincoln, what they did to eradicate slavery. According to the new rules of intersectionality and critical race theory and all this other nonsense, those two would have been precluded from championing championing the abolition movement.
Yes.
So it is just really ridiculous.
Well, let's get into a couple more because you got 16 chapters, and I want to cover as much as I can. Gender madness. I did not have any idea that after we brought about what was considered a victory for the LGBT community, that the T would rise up, and now we'd begin to question whether or not gender is binary and a variety of other issues. And you devote some chapters to that issue as well, don't you?
Yeah, here's the thing. This, apart from abortion, this might be the worst in the litany of craziness of the leftist ideas that I explore in this book. Gender ideology says that our sex is not determined by our biological sex that we were assigned at birth, as if we were assigned it, whatever, but whether you have male organs or female organs. No, it's not about that. It's about how you identify when you're old enough to identify. Of course, and so gender is fluid. This, by the way, it shows how the left eats its own. The homosexual movement from the left used to say that you were born gay or not, and so you couldn't change that. Now there's gender fluidity, and the transgender movement, which has sucked all the oxygen out of the room for the homosexuals and largely for the feminists, says that no, you can change however you identify. You're either a male or female, just according to what you want to be. And so now a woman who goes out and is an activist for women's rights and says, I have a vagina, I'm proud of it, is shouted down by the transgender movement because they say women aren't the only people who have vaginas. Men who identify as women, people with vaginas are not just, let me back up. You can be without a vagina, I should say, and still be a female. That's what they're saying. And so you can't proudly proclaim I have a vagina because you're leaving out the men who identify as women. Kerby, here's what I'm saying. I do not believe in my heart of hearts that even 25% of rank-and-file Democrats believe this insanity, this moral and intellectual anarchy that one's sex is determined by how you arbitrarily identify. Everybody knows that the idea of 70-plus genders is absurd.
Yes.
But yet they're afraid. They're afraid to counter political correctness because they'll get savaged in the culture. And you ask, well, then why do they vote for Democrats that are promulgating these crazy ideas? And then I might say it's probably because the left has so successfully demonized conservatives and Republicans as racist, sexist, and the rest that they deem it a lesser of evils. They're going to accept insanity over identifying with people they think are evil. They've been lied to about how we are as racists, and we're not. That's the only way I can explain it.
David Limbaugh, we'll be right back.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with David Limbaugh as we talk about his new book, Guilty by Reason of Insanity. And if you'd like to join us, let's open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. First of all, you probably can find the book in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to davidlimbaugh.com. And I might just commend to you real quickly the books we've talked about with him in the past, the Emmaus Code, Finding Jesus in the Old Testament, The True Jesus, Uncovering the Divinity of Christ in the Gospels, Jesus is Risen, Paul in the Early Church, and some of the others. But, of course, he's returned back to a political book that addresses some of those issues. But if you'd like to know more about David Limbaugh's other books, those are all available at his website. And, of course, we have those available at our website, pointofview.net. David, let's get into leftist intolerance and hate, leftist authoritarianism. This is an argument that more recently Dennis Prager made in our studio here. The difference between the left and liberals. You know, your classic liberal would say, look, I may disagree with your viewpoint, but I defend the right of you to say that. But the left doesn't say that. They say you don't have a right to say that. I am going to be intolerant of your intolerance. If you don't see the irony there, I don't know what it is. And I'm going to be authoritarian and not even allow you to have free speech on a college campus or even in the media. Tell us more.
That's right. And Dennis Prager's exactly right about that. You will not see this kind of intolerance on the right. While they want to make us think that Donald Trump, for example, is authoritarian, when in fact he's not violating his authority under the Constitution. He's not issuing lawless executive orders. It's the left, through judicial activism, who are thwarting his lawful orders and even making them nationwide through one single district court in one of the hundreds of districts, issuing orders that are to apply nationwide. Their lawless executive orders when they hold the presidency. And there are various other mechanisms of forcing us to do what they want us to do, violating speech, refusing conservatives a forum on college campuses, shunning conservatives in the classroom. There's an authoritarian bent among the left now where they won't even allow certain Trump supporters to go into restaurants, such as when they hounded Sarah Huckabee Sanders out of the Red Hen in a restaurant because she works for Donald Trump. You can't wear a MAGA hat some places in society because you might be beaten up. I challenge anyone to say that would happen in reverse, that if you are wearing an Obama hat, that you have to be fearful anywhere you go in the United States. That's just not true. That doesn't happen hardly at all. No liberal college student has to be afraid to reveal his or her political views to his professor for fear of being ridiculed or that having his grade reduced. So the left is authoritarian and intolerant. They want to force Christians to subscribe to their theories and reject their own worldview. For example, it's not enough for us to say, I'll live and let live. Homosexuals can live all they can live in freedom, and we won't get into their so-called bedrooms. But society now has to sanction same-sex marriage, and it did not sanction it. But then the judiciary, by fiat, sanctioned it. Now we've all got to accept it. Well, that's fine. Now we're past that. But now we go further. You have to, the federal government and state governments, county governments will force bakers and florists to produce their product in celebration of a same-sex marriage ceremony or of a transgender transition. And if they don't, they can be shut down or fined exorbitant amounts. It's not a live and let live thing. It's an oppression. They're forcing us. They're forcing conservatives and Christians to pay for abortion through federal funding, taxpayer funding of abortion. It is really, I've just never seen anything like the violation of conscience that they're doing, and they don't have any problem with it because they're dogmatic and authoritarian.
We'll get to abortion in just a minute because you raised that, but I just thought for a minute, one of the things you do remind us of is that sometimes even liberal professors are subject to PC wrath, and you use the example of these two Yale professors where I went to graduate school who were simply, since we're just back from Halloween here, they were kind of concerned about some of the students that were saying you couldn't have certain Halloween costumes and everything. And basically, they just said, come on, lighten up. Oh, my goodness, that just cut loose. And I think it illustrates the point that Dennis Prager made on the program here when he was in studio, that, we say to the liberals, the conservatives aren't your enemy. The left is your enemy. If you're a liberal right now and you stray a little bit off of the leftist PC plantation, you're in real trouble, aren't you?
Yeah, well, the trouble is there aren't many liberals anymore. They've almost all gone to the left. This idea of tolerance of opposing views is no longer welcome on the left. And you bring up one of the most egregious examples, which I have in my book, and that is these students were outraged when their sponsors, these professors, by the way, liberal professors somewhere in the East, they're kind of their advisors for their dorm, and they're both liberals, they're both professors, and are leftists, whatever you want to call them, progressives, and the wife wrote an article or wrote some kind of an email saying, as you said, let's not talk about cultural appropriation on Halloween. People are just having fun by dressing up as someone else. They're not pretending to be another race, and they're not denigrating any other culture. Just lighten up, as you said, Kerby. And this outraged some of the minority leftist students. And if you watch the video, I have never been so appalled. These students were yelling the F word at these professors who defended themselves for saying, look, lighten up. You haven't lived what I've lived. You can't possibly talk about our oppression because you're not black. You are white. Why the F are you even in my face? Why are you in our dorms? Why don't you just go get another job? The most hateful thing, I just challenge people to watch the video and see, regardless of anyone's views, is this how we want to encourage our young people, our students, to treat their professors with such disrespect? This is what the left does. You can disrespect even authority figures all you want to, because if they don't say exactly what you prescribe that they say. This is a big deal. We talk about it being an anecdote in the book. It is a major deal that is reflective of the left's attitude towards dissenting views. By the way, dissenting views against their objectively crazy ideas. The idea of cultural appropriation, give me a break. I mean, we are mostly celebrating other cultures when we dress up, making fun of them. We might be making fun of ourselves, but the idea that everybody just can't wait to be offended, isn't that kind of scary, Kerby, that we're living in that society? And I go back to what I said before. They want people at each other's throats. They want them mad at each other. They want them to hate each other. This is darn near demonic, is what it is, in attitude.
And it's one of the reasons why you have a lot of comedians saying, I don't even go on college campuses anymore, because all it would take is one joke that would be wrenched out of context, that would be seen by somebody who is already an aggrieved victim, and they couldn't even be able to laugh at something that even 5 years ago would have been considered humorous, but today you just can't. So there's just a lot of individuals saying, I'm not even going to go on the campus anymore because it's just got so crazy. And it's just a good illustration of that.
Seinfeld says it, and then people have gone on, and these leftists have critiqued old episodes of Seinfeld and said how terrible they are. They make fun of Japanese people being small in stature and putting them in dresser drawers, and how offensive that is, or gay jokes or whatever. Now everybody resurrects the past just for an opportunity to savor the notion of being mad and indignant. That's the idea. They want everybody to be mad. I'm not kidding you. It is, and it's just, it was all done in fun back then. And like you say, Kevin Hart, he said something 10 years ago. He was going to host the Academy Awards or whatever it was, and they dredged up something he'd said in the past about he wouldn't want one of his kids to be a homosexual. And so they savaged him, and they basically bullied him out of doing the Academy Awards or whatever award ceremony it was. And his apology wasn't enough. They said, no, one leftist wrote in an opinion piece, this bigotry and this atoning for bigotry is like a math problem. You not only have to get the answer right, you have to show your work. So Kevin Hart didn't get atonement by apologizing and saying he was sorry. He needs to do a skit on homosexuality and bludgeon himself in public and say how sorry he is, or he has to donate to gay causes, LGBTQ causes, or otherwise he will not be accepted and forgiven.
We'll take a break and talk a little bit about abortion and Trump derangement syndrome right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
David Limbaugh with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Guilty by Reason of Insanity. And David, I thought for just a minute we talk about abortion before we get into the whole issue of Trump derangement syndrome. We've, of course, had abortion for some time. There have been various proponents promoting abortion, but the change has been that now we're talking about abortion right up to birth. And I think there is a sense in which there are some on the left that are convinced, I think maybe rightly so, that someday Roe versus Wade will be overturned. It goes back to the states. So that's why you're hearing the kinds of things out of the governor of Virginia. You're seeing people being applauded in Albany, New York. But again, this is, the idea that you talk about shouting your abortion while attacking Christians. Tell us more.
Well, it used to be that the left pretended to want to make abortion safe, legal, and rare, which never really made a lot of sense if they believed that the unborn was a clump of cells. If an unborn is not a human being or anything approaching it, what difference does it make? Why would you want to make it rare? So that was always a lie that never stood the test. But now with 4D technology and other advancements in technology and our understanding that pain occurs in the early weeks, that the heartbeat begins at 6 weeks or even earlier, they can no longer credibly deny that what is inside a mother's womb is an actual baby. And shockingly, instead of capitulating on this issue like decent people would and saying we're not going to condone abortion, they say we're going to condone it, we're going to encourage it, and we're going to shout our abortion. We're going to glorify what we do. We're going to light up towers in New York with ghoulish pink celebrating our abortion. We're going to have professors that go out and speak on college campuses articulating and expressing that abortion is actually a moral good. Now, this is so sick. This is a level of depravity that we haven't seen since biblical times when God ordered the Israelites to destroy the Canaanites in the entirety of their civilization precisely because of their idolatry and their child sacrifice and their glorification of evil. This is the kind of culture we are rapidly acquiring, and it shocks me that we have gone this far, that the left is this openly craven and depraved. And I know I'm not supposed to say that I'm supposed to be more winsome, and I want to be winsome, but I also don't want to sacrifice the truth in the process. So if you say to me, these pictures and videos that depict what actually occurs in an abortion, you can see the baby. In an 8-second video, certain people have been converted automatically against abortion because they can see it. And if you tell me, well, that's a terrible thing to show those videos, it's so offensive, my response is it's a terrible thing to offend people, but how much more terrible is it to allow the baby to be killed? So are we going to worry about our sensitivity as human beings and not be offended? Are we going to prioritize that above the very safety of the innocent unborn? And my answer is no. I would like to do it winsomely. I've yet to figure out a really good way to do that. But I would say this. We are making progress in the body politic. A majority of Americans, overwhelming majority actually, I think, are against abortion after the first trimester. And so the left, which has now taken a position, as you said, of advocating abortion up to the point of birth and even beyond, outright infanticide, are out of phase, out of step with the overwhelming majority of the American people. I'm not sure Roe versus Wade will be overturned, by the way, because Justice Roberts and Kavanaugh might pay such fealty to precedent that they say, even though it's a law, even though it's an improperly decided opinion under the Constitution, Roe versus Wade in 1973, it's been with us for almost 50 years, and constitutional jurisprudence requires that we honor even bad precedent. I don't think it does, but I think that might be. They may lack the courage to overturn it. I really think they might.
Just before we let you go here, let's talk about Trump derangement syndrome, because you talk about politicians, entertainers, people in the media, and that really kind of underscores all of this, that this has been, we always hear people talking about a divided country, but there are a lot of people that have had their picture with Donald Trump and only began to say, well, he's a bad man or he's a racist, only once he was elected and began to implement some of the policies that you have endorsed for all these years.
That's right. And a lot of us thought Trump might be more liberal than he turned out being, because he was no radical conservative by any means. And he learned the hard way just how mean-spirited the left is when he ran as a Republican. But it is irrational how much they hate Trump and the way they lie about him. I understand the objections to Trump on the crudeness and the unorthodoxy and all, but he doesn't even approach their level of vitriol every day. They call him a Nazi, a racist, And I really, in my heart of hearts, do not believe he's a racist. He wants to protect our borders. He wants to protect American sovereignty, and it is not because people have a different skin color in Mexico. It is because we want people to embrace the American idea and learn their civics and Constitution before they become naturalized as citizens. We want immigration to be an orderly process. We want immigrants to assimilate into our community, and no self-respecting nation that intends to perpetuate its existence as a nation state can allow itself to have open borders. And Trump is not a racist because he advocates guarding the borders, which even Democrats did as recently as 8 years ago. They all the Democratic leaders from Obama to Clinton, all of them knew and said we had to protect our borders. But now it's convenient. They can call Trump a racist because he wants to protect the borders. And it's a vicious slander when they call him that. And also saying that he's an autocrat and that he's a tyrant. He is advocating free market ideas. He's advocating constitutionalism. He's appointing judges who respect, not violate the Constitution. And the point of respecting and upholding the Constitution is that it ensures a system of limited government. And it is limited government guaranteed by the Constitution that makes possible our individual liberties. So he is liberal in the classic sense of the term, and these illiberal leftists want to shut him down and falsely claim that he's authoritarian. Just because he was some kind of a corporate mogul, that makes him authoritarian. He's not authoritarian as it pertains to his attitude toward government and the exercise of government power.
Again, David Limbaugh has been with us. The book is entitled Guilty by Reason of Insanity. You should be able to find it in any bookstore. There's an order form where you can get it on his website, davidlimbaugh.com, and it's a good place by going to that website to find some of the other books that David Limbaugh has written. Especially, let me commend to you some of those on Christianity and, of course, all of his political books. This is the 10th book in the series that he has put together with Regnery, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. David Limbaugh, always great to have you on the program.
Kerby, great and I love listening to your commentary on the break. You have the greatest commentary. You have such common biblical sense. I want to applaud you and tell your audience how much I respect what you stand for and how you express it.
Well, thank you very much. We need to take a break, and then when we come back tomorrow, I'm going to actually do a teaching on the issue in the first hour. Actually, it'll be an hour that is not on the national program, but you can certainly listen to it, on the subject of Islam and why the actual defeat of ISIS is imminent and the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is so important. And then we're going to have our roundtable discussion, so we'll be doing that. And then later in the week, we have a variety of other guests. Mary Jo Sharp will be with us, Robert Hutchison. I mean, it's just going to be a great week of various interviews, but also a chance to continue watching what's happening in the political campaign and the impeachment inquiry. I want to thank Andrew and Steve. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.